A friend of mine had this little outlook, was he always likes to be like going towards a positive rather than like trying to fix a negative, you know what I mean? Like always be going towards something that you want rather than away from something you don't, you know what I mean? Like, so frame it in your mind where you're going towards something nice rather than framing it in your mind like I'm trying to go away from this thing I don't like.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Today's episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is sponsored by Roswell Pro Audio, maker of handcrafted microphones in California. Inspired design and impeccable attention to detail will help you capture a gorgeous vintage sound without the vintage price tag. Check out their beautiful line of microphones at roswellproaudio.com. You may already know that using true analog gear is one of the best ways to create a great record. Yet increasingly, we live in a digital world, recording and mixing inside the computer. So what if you could have the best of both worlds? Tigler Audio Manufaktur is bridging the analog-digital divide by creating high-end analog gear like the Schwerkraftmaschine compressor and the Raumzeitmaschine reverb, whose knobs you can control remotely using a plugin in your DAW. Or their many analog units like the Cream bus compressor with mastering EQ, or the Veritube recording channel that let you save your settings using a custom recall sheet plugin, offering a complete line of pro audio gear from compressors to EQs to reverbs and beyond. Now you can get a pro analog sound while benefiting from the power of digital. Let your DAW help you move your knobs so that your music can move you. Click the link in the show notes to learn more about Tigler Audio Manufaktur. Hey Rockstars, it's your host Lid Shaw, and welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Nick Krill, a brilliant songwriter, producer, and engineer whom I have known since he was a teenager in the late 1990s when I co-produced his band, the Spinto Band, with Robin Eaton. Nick now lives in Philadelphia, but also works in New York City professionally as both a musician and a producer-mixer. He has since toured the globe as a member of various bands, including the Spinto Band, Teen Men, and Clap Your Hands, Say Yeah. And on the control room side of the studio glass, Nick has worked as a producer, engineer, or mixer for bands such as The Dove and the Wolf, The Teeth, Jesse Hale Moore, Nightlands, Eliza Hardy Jones, and The War on Drugs. Nick is great at creating expressive indie pop productions that feature great guitar hooks, otherworldly keyboards, and tight, punchy drums. So we're going to dig into all these production tips and more on today's episode. I'm super psyched to have one of my favorite musicians on the podcast today. Please welcome Nick Krill to Recording Studio Rockstars. Nick, dude, are you ready to rock, man?
No doubt about it.
I feel like you and I have actually said that before in the studio, probably many times before press and record.
Yeah, sure. Very familiar to hearing that over the talkback with you.
Indeed. Yeah, but it has been a while. It's great to sort of reconnect with you recently. You came through Nashville when you were touring with Clap Your Hands, Say Yeah, and we got to hang out. And it's really impressive going through your discography and really getting to know all these records you've been working on because, you and I worked so much, but that was nearly 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I guess 12 at this point since we did Nice and Nicely Done. But you've just done a ton of great stuff.
Oh, thanks, man. Yeah, I've been trying to keep busy.
Tell us a little bit more about how you got started. I know you, so I refer to the listeners on the show as the rock stars. So if you hear me speaking to the rock stars, that's what that's all about. But rock stars, when I met you, Nick, you guys already had the Spinto Band and you showed up at Alex the Great to work with Robin and I, and you already were making your own CDs and putting them out. And literally you had just put out a song or a CD with 70 songs on it, or it was like a double CD. So you guys were doing tons of cool stuff, incredibly prolific, incredibly creative. And as I recall, you sort of had Robin's old ADAT machine, right?
Yeah, we were the beneficiaries of a lot of great old hand-me-down stuff from Robin so we ended up with his ADAT and like a little Mackie mixer, and then also a couple of the other guys in the band, their parents were in a band as well, so we got a lot of their hand-me-down stuff, like their old PVPA head mixer and 4-tracks and stuff like that. So
nice.
Yeah, we got off to a pretty cool start there in the basement.
And then, as I also recall, you didn't really have a computer DAW to work with. Pro Tools was out at that point, but you guys weren't really at that level yet. But you guys were using like, not Final Cut Pro, something else. Maybe it was Final Cut.
Cool Edit?
Cool Edit. Yeah, Cool Edit or some film. It was like a film editing app that you were just use the audio side of to compose all these songs and loop things.
Yeah, I feel like at that point when we each branched off into like we were on the ADAT mode, and then we each sort of tumbled into different little digital audio workstations. One of the guys was very into filmmaking, so he ended up just like doing a lot of recording in the Avid video editor. And then Cool Edit Pro was in there. Pro Tools Free was in the mix there at some point.
So that was Albert, who went off to go make movies. So he started out with you guys in the band, but then kind of decided he wanted to make movies. Why don't you give him a shout out right now? Is there any films people want to know about Albert's that they should be checking out?
Oh yeah, for sure. He just finished a movie called Silvio, which just came out. Everyone should run, don't walk to your nearest wherever you can find that movie and check it out. It's pretty great. It's a story about a gorilla trying to just navigate life. You know, it's that age old question. But yeah, shout out to him. Shout out to Tom from the Spinto Band. He just released a really cool record called by his other band, Carol Cleveland Sings.
Oh, cool.
So check that out. It's a kind of amazing, like bedroom, like Van Dyke Park's in a bedroom in 2017 kind of sounding stuff. And yeah, everybody's up to no good with those guys, just like scratching around making cool stuff.
That's awesome, man. Are you playing a bunch together still as the Spinto Band now, or has everybody kind of gone off to do their solo projects for a little while until you guys get the itch again?
A little bit of everything. We just did a handful of shows this summer to kind of commemorate the 10th birthday 2 years late of that Nice and Nicely Done record. We just reissued it in the States with a ton of B-sides, or not B-sides, but just sort of outtakes from those sessions.
That's right. I've got it right behind me.
Yeah, so to kind of celebrate that, we did a bunch of shows this summer. And now we're all kind of hunkering down for the winter, getting into our other things.
Awesome, man. Well, so talk a little bit more about starting out and recording. I mean, one of the things I admired about you is that you guys were very creative with the tools you had. So nothing was ever too lo-fi to be useful. Nothing was ever too old school to be, capable of making something new and different. And were you starting out with 4-track cassettes as well?
Yeah, 4-track cassettes. And before that, I was doing kind of like the classic thing where I would record. I had this little Radio Shack cassette recorder, just a stereo cassette recorder. And I record something on that and put that tape in my parents' home stereo, like crank up the volume and play the drum track over the stereo while I recorded a guitar part onto another tape, and then kind of like do this crazy bounce back and forth through the home stereo and the cassette tape. And then eventually I ripped out the erase head on that cassette deck so I could kind of just like endlessly overdub on the cassette, which was kind of fun. Nice. Yeah, it was sort of weird. Like everything would get degraded and muffled and crazy the more layers you went. And you could never mess up.
It just keeps saturating.
Yeah, and I would definitely mess up. So that didn't last too long, but it was a fun experiment.
I like that. Just physically rip out the erase head.
Yeah.
Well, cool, man. So now what are you using to record with these days?
Nowadays it's a normal little Pro Tools workstation. Most every place I work out of has a Pro Tools rig of some kind. My own mixing suite that I have at home is also just running classic little efficient Pro Tools. Yeah, nothing too fancy.
Do you have sort of like a newer version or an older one, or do you feel like that's an important thing to even be concerned with these days, or how does that work for you?
I actually stay. I kind of have I don't know if this is a common belief, but I try and keep my Pro Tools system almost like a time capsule in whatever kind of computer version I get. Mm-hmm. And I kind of mostly part of that is like I try and build a system and then just like once it's really working, just ride with that as long as I can. Because in the past, I've kind of gotten bit in the butt, like trying to, like I've upgraded something and now opening old projects is a problem. Or like, some band might say, oh man, we just got, our song picked up for this commercial. Can you run off stems, or can you do something, but like, just turn just the drums from the first verse solo, like, something weird like that. And I'll go in and maybe I'd upgraded and all of a sudden a plugin wouldn't work or something crazy would happen. So to kind of maintain a little like archive system, I sort of just like double down on a version and then try and ride that as long as I can. Yeah. So like right now I have the version of Pro Tools that is, it's like, I think it's running Mountain Lion or it's like the last operating system where you could boot both 10 and 11. Right. So I can, I'm considering this like my Rosetta Stone machine that has like, I can open all my old 32-bit sessions. And then I also have a rig that is sort of more current that can run AAX plugins and stuff like that. So, that's the way I kind of like to do things. And I always feel like whenever you upgrade something, it gets screwy. Even if it's like a plugin version, I've had things where I've like, let me upgrade to this version 5 of a plugin, and I'll do it. And it's like, oh, wait a second. Now this weird glitch is happening. Like, well, let's go back to the old one. Yeah. And I always save my old installers. Like I log my installers. That's a good tip for people. Log your installers and just keep them around so you can always kind of like double back, like retrace your steps to when your computer was rock solid. So
yeah, I think that's good. I used to do a lot more of that back in the old days. Now I think with app stores and stuff, I just kind of hit the button. But it's smart, and I've certainly run into upgrade problems where I upgrade myself into a corner. And I think I like the idea of having a system that kind of matches the computer you've got, because at some point you may need to upgrade the computer anyway. And at that point you can just kind of upgrade the computer and just jump to the new upgraded system all at once. If you were the Library of Congress, I'm sure you'd keep around a system that would play back the old stuff, and you just sort of keep that sacred.
Yep. Yeah. Well, actually, anyway. I do kind of have my little Library of Congress closet in my house, which has my old computer that runs, I think Pro Tools 5 is what it's running. So it's like my previous rig. In theory, I should be able to dig into all those old sessions. I guess the wild card would be like if the bearings on the hard drive still work next time I need to like yeah, really fire it up. So I don't know. Sometimes I come from a family of both my parents worked in a museum. So like I have this sort of like respect for the archive and like, maintaining items and artifacts for the future. But then sometimes I just want to just like, forget all this stuff. I just need to like make music and like just go into this with abandon. But, I don't know. There's time for everything, I guess.
Yeah. It's all about balance, right?
Yeah.
So I dig that, Nick. And when I come visit you next, I want to come see your Library of Congress closet.
Yeah, man.
I think you've just coined it.
Yeah, I'm looking right now. I can see the old 4-track we used in the Spinto Band basement is there. We have the old G4 that runs Pro Tools 5. We have We have the ADATs. Everything is there.
Nice, man. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, so I also like to ask guests to share an inspirational quote to kick off the podcast. Have you got anything you want to share with us to kind of get us psyched about hitting the studio?
I just say can't stop, won't stop,
Can't stop, won't stop.
Yeah, man.
I like it, man.
Get in there, keep recording.
I knew you when you started, or at least, actually I can't say that because like I said, when I met you, you put out CDs with 70 songs recorded on it. So you already started well before that.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess so just going for it.
So do you see yourself just doing this? This is like a lifetime pursuit.
Oh yeah, definitely.
How about sharing a story about kind of an important failure for you along the way, whether it was something to do with like career path or something that happened in the studio, but you've been doing this for a long time and it's kind of nice to hear stories about how it wasn't always going so well, just as an encouragement to all of us,
Yeah, for sure. One that jumps to mind is actually, it was just in the studio producing a record for somebody, and it was kind of a moment where I like the blinders went away from my eyes as far as ways to approach musicians and how they perform best in the studio. So in this particular case, someone had come in to lay down a solo. It was somebody's project. Like, I'm going to bring in my friend to rip a solo on this song. Like, oh, great, that sounds awesome. And I remember like they set up and we were recording away, and we were just like, oh, let's get a sound and try some takes. And it's like, oh, cool. Oh man, this is great. Oh, sounds great. Oh my gosh, this is awesome. Oh, and then like they try it again. Like, oh hey, and then I'd say, oh man, can you try that thing again where you went like, you kind of hung on that G for a second and then you did a double stop. And I kind of like was giving them a lot of specific directions.
Like anybody else, like maybe me.
Well, what I kind of like, I realized after maybe 20 minutes of this, I realized like, am I just like, I'm trying to tell this person how to play a Nick Krill solo. That's counterproductive, like this guy's here to rip a solo for himself, And so it's kind of, I sort of just like got super, super nitpicky when I really shouldn't have been. Mm-hmm. And it kind of, that was a moment where I just kind of, he was getting frustrated and it kind of like, made a little bit, not a terrible vibe, but it wasn't super pleasant. But like on a more general sense, it kind of made me, step out of my head and for the first time really think about like different types of musical brains and kind of what ways to guide different personalities. Like this person wasn't there for me to like tell them like what notes to play or have or like give them specific musical ideas. It needed to be a lot more general, like, oh hey, why don't you try a lower octave? Go for it, like stuff like that.
Yeah.
Whereas, and then like there's other people who are exact opposite, where they are maybe a very technical player, but they need something to jumpstart an actual part, So it was just a moment that I completely kind of whiffed in the studio, but it made me go home that night and really think about like, oh, I need to have my radar more finely tuned to each musician's personality.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've definitely seen variations of that. I've certainly screwed up, in a big way doing that. I was just doing guitar overdubs today and I had to catch myself, in that middle ground between trying to be helpful, but not being overbearing and too specific in an idea. Yeah. And I think it's tricky. How do you feel like what have you learned about being in tune with the musician and knowing what kind of helping hand would be best suited for that situation?
Well, I think it's really just, you need to keep your senses around you when you're kind of first meeting a new musician, and your senses around you with like what this session is actually involving. You kind of just need to like balance all the variables, like musician's personality. Why are they here? What is the session? Like, why did the session bring this person in here? You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And kind of thread all those different needles, and then you'll kind of hopefully arrive at an approach. Like I said before, like a lot of times if you hang out with a musician for a little bit or you're on the session, you'll kind of realize what makes them tick. Like, are they really into getting sounds, but maybe not particularly fine-tuned at like picking cool harmonies or like melodies? They're more like, oh, let me get a cool sound. Then maybe you let them do that, and then you guide them gently when it comes to specific part ideas.
Yeah.
And then other people are maybe the exact opposite. They're very, like, they would maybe compose something, but have no idea or no interest in what it would sound like. They're like, oh, you do that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So you kind of just sort of see what they're interested in, what they're not interested in, what they're really good at, what they're not good at, and then try and just boost all the things that they like and that they're good at, and kind of downplay or take care of yourself the things that they are not good at or not interested in,
Yeah. Well, so it also makes me wonder if you want to talk about the difference between how that process goes when you're working with your own band versus how that process goes when you're working with a totally different band as a producer engineer. Because, you spent a lot of time recording the Spinto Band, and I don't remember what you called it, but I remember at one point, I don't know if you still have it now, but there was a studio where you set up a studio space, but it was kind of like the garden section of some old store. And you'd use all the garden hangers for display racks for all your cables or something. Can you tell us about that?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, it was the Spinto Band studio that was called the Garden Center, and that's exactly what it was. It was an old, abandoned, garden supply store that was kind of this perfect, weird little studio spot. And when we went in to rent the place, it kind of looked like the previous tenants had kind of gotten a phone call to leave and like got out within 15 minutes. So there was all this weird garden stuff still around. So a lot of crazy old garden pots became giant like reverb resonators and garden hooks for cables and all this kind of weird stuff.
That's cool.
But,
how about hose? Did they leave hose around, or did you make yourselves a Cooper time cube?
No, we didn't end up doing that. They had this crazy, actually old chicken coop that became a reverb chamber. That was pretty amazing. And then these sheet metal cubes that were in various sizes. So some of the cubes were maybe as big as a cinder block, and then some of them were maybe as big as a giant equipment rack.
Mm-hmm.
And so those guys became our weird, unique reverberators too, just like setting up a box in front of an amp and then kind of miking however it would vibrate, that kind of stuff.
Interesting. So what tips do you have for helping people think outside the box in terms of, looking around the space around them and finding that there are reverbs and sounds, in the natural environment? What else can you tell us about that? How would you even set that up if you were going to try and use something naturally acoustic for reverb?
Well, I guess it depends on the thing. When it has to do with like those little boxes, for example, we would just try different things like pointing an amp in it, maybe setting it up so that it was, you put an amp on its back and then put something that's going to rattle or resonate on top of the amp and then mic that. That kind of stuff.
Oh yeah, that's cool, man. Yeah, you were talking about that earlier. You said one of the things you really like to do is kind of treated instruments. I mean, I'm familiar with the treated piano idea where you basically just lay jangly things on top of the strings, but it sounds like you're doing that to more stuff.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, it's kind of just developed I sort of realized with myself that I have a interest in like the physical space and working with things physically and mechanically, versus like electronically or something like that. Like I just have a natural inclination to do things like that. So for example, I always liked sculpture. I always like bending, making little wire sculptures. I always like working with my hands. I always like carving things out of a block, that kind of stuff. So it's sort of a few years ago, it sort of just occurred to me like there's a lot of things in this world of recording that are very electronics based. And it sort of occurred to me like, well, wait a second. You really love building things. Why don't you apply that to these instruments? And so that kind of led me to like treating the instruments with different things. So, yeah, you know, it sometimes like a guitar, I do a lot of guitar recording. So it'll be a lot of things about like jamming stuff in the strings, or like, it's not so much thinking about it like, I want to like put stuff on the piano strings so they rattle. It's almost like the end goal is just to make me or whoever's playing it physically interact with the instrument in a new way. And I think that like, I realize once you're physically playing the instrument differently, you kind of get in this whole unique headspace that kind of, I think can help you, you know, just play or at least be aware of what you're recording in maybe a unique way. So, yeah. So, for example, like I remember on a session, we were having like the age-old problem of like, oh, this hi-hat is kind of like really dogging us. So we just crammed newspaper into the cavity of the hi-hat. So it sort of muffled it. But then I remember when he would do an open hi-hat, it wouldn't get muffled. You know, that would still kind of resonate because the paper wouldn't like, you know, still mute it. So it's sort of this interesting moment where like, because of that crazy contrast, the drummer was way more keenly aware of how he was playing that hi-hat, which I think went an exponentially like, well, I think that just did a great deal for him to like improve his performance when all of a sudden like there was this problematic thing and now he is very tuned into it because we're like physically messing with it. Yeah. And then on top of that, that contrast in sound just kind of became a cool thing and became like, oh wait, this can be a feature, not a bug now. And I remember it was a really amazing feeling when there was a band member who was coming in late to the session and they came in and they were like, wow, what a crazy hi-hat. I was like, whoa, sweet, it's working.
Well, it makes me think too, like when you talked about giving direction, you know, one sort of direction might work for one musician, but you might have to do a totally different approach for a different musician. You kind of got to read them. I could see that could work for comfort in the studio. Like a band shows up and you got to get them settled in. And on the one hand, you might want to make them as comfortable as possible so that they feel at ease to get settled in. But on the other hand, sometimes to push the creativity, once everybody's settled in, it's like, okay, this is our home now. Then it's like, then you actually might want to make them a little, you know, push them out of their comfort zone on an instrument so that they start having to, like you say, get into this whole new headspace for how to create.
Yeah, it's sort of, you know, like we've been saying, read the situation and see what happens. Like if this guy is completely frustrated, maybe that's not the move, but it was a situation where it was really worked great, you know, or like, yeah, just kind of like, just getting people to think a little differently about how they approach an instrument, that kind of stuff. So and it doesn't have to be like crazy, like, oh, jam some weird thing in there. It can be something as simple as like a different gauge string of a guitar. Like I find I have a couple, I normally play kind of heavy strings, but I have a couple like just throwaway guitars around the house that have 9s on them, like super light strings, because I find when I play them, I just play it differently. Like it's, if you sit there and play an electric guitar versus an acoustic guitar, you kind of go down these different areas potentially. And I think it's just taking that idea and, you know, trying to.
Or have you ever played an acoustic guitar that was strung up with electric strings?
Yeah, all that kind of, like, yeah, it's great. All that kind of weird stuff. In fact, I broke my first acoustic guitar by doing just that.
Oh, really? Why'd you wind it up too tight or something?
Well, it was just like it was actually a classical guitar, and I just put steel electric strings on it, and the tension did not really do it any favors. And now it's kind of got this weird like bubbly bow, and the action is like 2 inches high now from getting like turned, like wrenched in.
That's when you start breaking out a slide.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. Physically alter the instrument.
So when you were talking about, if somebody's sort of really struggling, maybe that's not the time to break it out, but it made me imagine like where you're playing a prank on somebody and you completely push them over the edge. So it made me want to ask you this question, and answer it now if you can think of it, or just hold on to it and see if you come back to one. But can you remember any great practical jokes in the studio?
Great practical jokes.
Yeah, like great stories of practical jokes that were played on during a session or on a band or a band member.
Oh yeah. This one's pretty tame, but I can remember this time we kind of I was telling the drummer a lot to take 5, and then it turned out his favorite candy bar was a take 5. And and then one session I just like taped one under his floor tom, and I was like, "Oh man, your floor tom, man, it's really dogging me. Something's going crazy. Can you figure it out? Like maybe it's a lug, maybe it's something on the bottom head." And then he found the candy bar. I was like, "Hey, why don't you take that candy bar's advice, man? We got to cut some bass right now."
Nice. So, yeah. I thought you were going to drop Dave Brubeck into the story there. Well, cool, man. So, another thing that you did or were a part of that was really intriguing to me looking through your discography was this Buried Beds project, the 100 Acres film. And that makes me think of kind of thinking outside the box and treated instruments. Tell us the story behind that particular project.
Oh yeah, that was really fun. I think so basically what that was this sort of short film that was like a live concert, but I don't know how to describe it. Let's see. So what it was actually that project was called Small Stories, and that was the song you mentioned was one of the songs on there, and what it was this live kind of performance / short film kind of thing, kind of inspired by the filmmaker who made it, Nate Johnson, this really kind of amazing dude in Philadelphia, sort of inspired by those film projects that Vincent Moon does. I guess the most notable are like those takeaway shows, and then he did a feature with like I think that band Efterklang. But what it was basically like a live video EP where we went to this kind of really cool mansion in Philadelphia with in one of the parks there, and set up. There's going to be 4 or 5 songs, and we set up 4 or 5 different locations for each song, and then kind of all recorded them all in the environment around the garden of this building or in like a little gazebo, and spent the day there just kind of like moving from song to song and moving from like recording space to recording space. And yeah, did this kind of really fun live outdoor kind of concert
cool.
video.
It looked like you had like 100 people playing drums or something like that.
Yeah, that was so all our buddies came to bang on floor toms and stuff like that.
So was this like a multi-track record, or was it more of like a performance that was just captured on the film camera?
No, it was a full live like multi-track session.
So what are some of the challenges of doing it outside like that?
Well, I guess the biggest challenge was just getting a rig out there. So just, getting a little multi-track Pro Tools rig and enough inputs to record like a live session with like, we didn't have like the Rolling Stones recording truck. So we just set up on like the second floor porch of this house and got a giant snake and just went for it, It was really kind of cool. I'm actually like recording outside was really kind of fun because essentially you're in just like a giant ISO booth in a way, because like you're hitting these instruments and making all this noise and it's just going out into space. So in a sense, it was kind of easier than I thought. Like once the logistics of actually miking stuff up and running the cable and like setting up the recording studio infrastructure in this crazy garden, once that stuff was in place, actually recording it was really fun.
That's cool. I'm glad to hear you bring that up because I've thought about that a bunch. In fact, I've been recording at the Bonnaroo Festival, and I got asked about recording at another festival here near Nashville. And there was this idea of doing it outside. And I was thinking the same thing. I was thinking, I think it would actually be easier to mic up a band rocking out outside with no walls and get great isolation on all the instruments because there are no walls bouncing everything back into the vocal mics and all that.
Yeah, exactly. It worked out pretty well.
Cool, man. Well, so also I wanted to ask you to tell us some stories about working with War on Drugs. I believe that was a recent project for you, right?
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah, I did some bunch of sessions engineering on their latest record, A Deeper Understanding, bunch of overdub sessions. So there's another engineer, Sean Everett, who was like mainly in charge of the tracking and mixing. And then there's a few other sessions back in our neck of the woods that I ended up doing the engineering on. It's really fun. Let's see. Specific stories you want to hear?
Yeah. Tell us what about the process. Like, what were you guys doing in the studio?
Well, let's see. I mean, I feel like, you know what? Actually, one of the funnest things about that well, first of all, they're super fun dudes to hang with and just like be in a room with. So that makes it fun. But I think one of my the coolest takeaways for me from it was actually we did a session at this old studio with a cool old big Helios console, and it was interesting.
Nice.
Yeah, it was really fun because it had been a while since I'd actually like done a session on like a console like firing on all cylinders in a while. Like I feel like so many studios these days have, maybe there's like a bunch of racks of a la carte boutique preamps. So you're like, oh man, like I got to try this. I got to try this one. I got to do this thing, or like vintage rack stuff. Mm-hmm. Or on the other side of things, maybe it's like that mobile rig for that thing, or a home studio setup where it's just like one or two really good outboard preamps. Mm-hmm. But just having a console was just so freaking great. I loved it. Like having setting up some aux sends to just be like fun, like a weird modulation on one send, or like a cool kind of like another send might be like an energy send, like a distortion or something crazy.
Energy.
That just is like that. Yeah.
Is that how you like to call it? If you're going to use something with distortion or saturation when you're mixing, do you just call it energy?
Yeah, I think that's what I think about it. Yeah. But yeah, it was just cool. It was sort of like to have a lot of inspirational decisions happens really easily because of a console. It's just like, oh man, I forgot how great this is.
Well, another thing is, when you have sort of an infinite number of choices, you feel obligated to choose, make the best choice. And when you work with a console, and that's like, those are your mic pre's, that's your mix return, those are your EQs. You let go of that decision process and start focusing on just how to use these and make the music great.
Yeah, totally. That's actually kind of the last year and a half, like including those sessions, really got me to try and approach my computer work with that same kind of mindset, mm-hmm. like maybe setting up some limitations for myself within the, like in the box when I'm mixing something, or that kind of stuff, just to kind of don't forget that it's like, oh yeah, there's amazing records made with just like 4 mono aux sends and maybe some mults to do something parallel. You know what I mean? Like, and maybe the rack of reverb is just like, oh, this guy has just 3 reverbs in a rack and he's going for it, or like one cool chamber. So yeah, it's sort of, like you said, your mind can run away with you a lot of times these days with just endless amounts of fun stuff to monkey with. But then dialing it back.
Then we never finish a record. We're just monkeying with it.
Yeah, just monkeying. But kind of dialing back and creating a system, like some kind of like large overall system to make your records, where it's like each little piece is connected to the other and like, I can't say bouncing off the other, but interacting, like each little piece of the studio interacting with each other. Kind of try to figure out ways to do that.
Well, tell us a little bit about your system now. When you're mixing, what are some recent ways that you really are enjoying approaching a mix? Like, how do you like to set it up? Do you have some particular tools within Pro Tools that you seem to go back to a lot?
Yeah, well, actually, I feel like now I'm in a moment of change in a way, just sort of kind of based on what we were just talking about. was I had a rig set up for external summing.
Well, it also reminded me of that old console you got. What was it, an APSI or something? That was the one you took back to the garden center.
Yeah, what I'm incorporating in my mix world is I'm sort of in this moment of exploring, because I kind of had a little sort of template that I was cruising with, and now I just found myself when using that system that I would have an idea for a sound or a way to do something, and I would say to myself, oh, better not do that. It's going to mess up the routing of your mix system. And then it kind of occurred to me, like, why would you do that? If you have some creative thing you want to express, why would you put a roadblock up that makes you stop doing that? So I sort of am in this moment of kind of tearing down everything that I was doing for the last couple of years and trying to come up with a new approach that doesn't do that. Like, that's kind of, I had been doing this analog outboard summing through a couple of different mixing boards. One was this old APSI board, which is kind of this weird, funky old mixer made by the dude who originally made those API graphic EQs. But it's just like a complete funky old mixer. And then another one, which is a little more hi-fi old Sony broadcast console. So I'd set up this kind of whole rig to do outboard summing with like a bunch of compressors set up for like different stems and all this thing. And I found myself in the middle of mixes thinking to myself, oh, I better cool it, because if I do XYZ, it's going to mess up my routing or make recall a real pain in the neck. And I was like, why am I doing that, man? Like, if it's going to make it sound awesome, I should just be going for it.
Yeah.
So that actually kind of got me out of the analog summing way. I was like, forget this. I'll just do it. Take whatever I learned about the sonics of that, keep that in my like aural memory, and kind of plow forward in the digital world, where I feel like the cool thing about it is like, I feel like you can be more free. You can just it's possible to make bold choices and not worry about like, oh, this is going to like break this piece of gear or make recalls a real pain in the neck or something.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, because I completely understand where you're coming from and I agree with you. And at the same time, I also have this perspective that real art comes from defining boundaries and then pushing up against those boundaries, you know?
Yeah, that's true.
And I don't know what that exactly means to all of us, but like the times where you work on a 1-inch 8-track and you only have 8 tracks to work with, obviously you make different decisions than when you have unlimited tracks.
Yeah.
But I like your idea. It's like, yeah, if the song is calling for something, you should do it, you know? You should be able to, that sound should be able to get gigantically loud with crazy delay all over it.
Yeah, I guess what I found myself, maybe what the way to describe the feelings I was having was I had like the artistic side of my brain like butting up against the technician side of my brain, and the technician inside my head, like the devil and the angel on each shoulder, the technician was like, whoa, hold up there, buddy. You're going off the rails. And then the artistic devil was like, yeah, come on. Let's go for it. So I think it was just sort of trying to balance, not necessarily like the limitations of a system, but just kind of get a better understanding of how my artistic and technical brain works.
I like that. So which side was the devil standing on? Which side was the angel standing on?
Oh, the angel was definitely standing on the side of, hey, now you better not turn up that compressor, because like, how are you going to recall this? Or like, and the devil was like, screw it, man.
Yeah, but I mean, like
76, crank it.
Literally, was the angel on the left side or the right side? Does that even matter?
It was actually a mid-side, believe it or not. Yeah.
Side. There you go. All right, cool, man. It was a Blumline pair of devil angels.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, cool. So let's see. Let's keep jumping around here. You told us a little bit about the way you're mixing. So now you're kind of mixing in the box. And have you found new barriers within the box yet? Like, have you found new limitations where you're like, oh crap, I can't get past this barrier? And do you have any advice for how to avoid those barriers?
I mean, the only barrier I keep coming up on is just little like CPU usage pop-ups, you know, like or like that kind of stuff. Nothing really, no really artistic barriers.
What do you do when you're running into a CPU thing? It's like now you got this creative idea, you're pulling up the plugin, you're going for it, and the computer is putting up messages on the screen, What's your first move in that situation?
Not just probably if in that situation, it would be just kind of like bounce stuff and consolidate, get rid of something that's having a lot of processing on it. Mm-hmm. Actually, look, right now I'm trying to kind of like just streamline how I even use plugins, because I feel like it's so easy to just keep like throwing up, trying to just like be economical about that, because I don't know, just like hanging out with a friend of mine who may be mixing on a console. It's like, he's not just like throwing up 5 different EQ plugins to like get the idea to work.
Right.
He's just making it work with like whatever channel strip and maybe some outboard cool thing, But I don't know. Yeah, but see, then it's like one's not better than the other though, It's like maybe throwing up 5 EQ plugins and just, you get it sounding one way and then like, I want to sound it a little different. Like whatever works best with your brain, just do that way,
Yeah.
I don't know. But I don't know. I feel like, to go back to your initial question, is just, bouncing and like making stuff inactive. Like, I mean, remember when I was on Pro Tools 5, I would always bounce and I would automate like bypasses and stuff like that. If a plugin wasn't being used, I'd automate a bypass just to squeeze every little last inch of my old G4. But now with the new computer, it's kind of a nice little workhorse. It doesn't really have too many glitches or anything.
Well, right on, man. Well, now I know you've also had the opportunity to work with some pretty great influencers. Just great producers, great mixers. Chad Blake, for example. What were some things that when you went with the Spinto Band to go work with Chad? That was Moonwink, right?
Yeah, he mixed that record. Yeah.
So tell us some of your takeaways from watching Chad work, and what did you learn from working with him?
Yeah, well, let's see. I feel like, kind of what we've sort of been talking about, just the whole idea of how the artistry of what you're doing really needs to be the king of the situation. I remember so this was probably 10 years ago when this happened. Yeah, it was 10 years ago. It was 2007. And like, I'd been in Philadelphia for a couple years, and I was like, doing mixes and getting my work going. I remember talking to a couple of different studio guys there, and they're saying like, oh man, you gotta come over to this place and try the summing on this. You gotta mix through this. You gotta try this. And like, oh, okay, cool. Let's try it. Yeah. Oh my gosh, that'd be awesome. And then I remember the next week going over to Chad's place in England where he was mixing, and he just had like basically like a Pro Tools rig mixing completely in the box. And I remember sitting there thinking like, well, this dude is creating sounds and like giving goosebumps to people. There's no summing or anywhere to be found. It's just like, it's coming from this guy's mind, Right.
He's not making it complicated.
Yeah. It's just like, and that was sort of like this moment, like, all right, forget worrying about summing, or like, I have so much more to learn before summing matters to me at that point, I think that was my biggest takeaway, is just sort of like his artistry and really trying to, be a unique artist and like in everything that you're doing, trying to find your own approach. Like another cool thing, I feel like in the stories he would tell about, I would ask questions like, oh man, like, how'd you do this sound? How'd you do that sound? And I felt like a common theme was always just like, oh, I wanted it to sound like XYZ. I couldn't figure out how to work this thing. So this other thing I did know how to work. So I figured out how to do it with that. So I was like, oh, cool. It was almost like the common theme was he would take his brain and like whatever was in the room, he would make it work with his brain, with his art vision, versus like getting bogged down and like having to figure out some way to do something. And in a way like that probably is what I don't know. I can't really speak for him, obviously, but it seemed like whether or not this is what he was thinking, what I came away with was that, wow, that is possibly a really cool way to come up with something truly unique for yourself, is like keep the way your artistic brain works at the forefront and match all this technical mumbo jumbo around you to your style of working.
Right. So it doesn't matter how you use any particular piece of gear, just so long as it's going in the direction of accomplishing that thing that's in your brain right now.
Yeah.
Cool, man.
Yeah, exactly.
So what about, if we're going to talk about mixing a little bit more, what about something as geeky as monitoring? And how do you listen to mixes to know that you're doing it right? What did you learn from Chad? What have you learned on your own? Do you have favorite monitors that you really enjoy listening to for your mix? Does that even matter?
Yeah, I think it does matter. I think it matters a lot. Just more than anything, understanding what monitors you have, obviously, and like listening to a lot of songs you really love through them, and then kind of understanding what your room is doing to what you're hearing, and like the placement of your speakers. I mean, I even kind of tweaked my speakers in my room a couple of days ago, just because I was like, oh, wait a second, like I want to try moving these speakers in a slightly different position to try and get a little bit more out of it, like the way I wanted to hear it. The worst thing is when you're fighting like what your brain, the music you want to hear in your brain, and then like the way the speakers are putting out the music just is not compatible with that.
Yeah.
Is sort of like you're just second guessing yourself. And like, even if you're listening to reference mixes and or like in a strange scenario or a strange room, and you're like, okay, like I know what this sounds like. It's sounding like this on this set of speakers. It's really rotten when you're having to kind of like reverse engineer an environment. Yeah. So like, yeah, I just try and get the sound coming out of the speakers to be like what I like to listen to music like. And then if I like listening to music, if they sound like the way I like to listen to music, then we're off to the races.
Right. Like in other words, if you're enjoying hearing music come out of the speakers, then you're going to be able to enjoy creating music on those speakers.
Yeah, for sure. And it's really, it kind of takes like a lot of just trial and error, like in whatever specific room you're in. And I've been in rooms before where like great speakers kind of were set up in a strange way that really threw off what people were hearing. And it kind of had to be like, oh, wait a second. We got to go back and figure this out. What's going on? So it's really a lot of trial and error, and just like, even like budget crappy speakers, they can sometimes like they can be positioned in a way that it's like, oh, cool. This is giving me what I dig about music. Let's go for it.
Nice. Well, now, how about sharing a story about working with Dave Trumpfio?
Cool,
what was the context of that?
That was also for the Moonwink record. And we went out to Dave's studio in Los Angeles to record that. It was interesting. I'm trying to think about...
Yeah, I remember stopping by and visiting you guys there. He had a cool Neve console. It was a really small space, but I feel like I saw something, a shift happen for you there, where you guys sort of maybe had your eyes opened to real precision in sounds and very, very tight drum sounds, which I've seen carry forward into these other records that I've heard you do.
That could be. I think a lot of that probably, so that record, in my mind, that record was like a game in arrangement, and like making a jigsaw puzzle arrangement. It's like, if you listen to that record, there's like a million things going on. And so sort of the musical game I feel like we were playing was like, get all those crazy ideas to actually like fit together. So yeah, I think trying to do precision sound, or like, kind of maybe was the way we thought we should approach that specific problem. Yeah,
like if sounds are too big, they don't leave enough room for the rest of the arrangement.
Yeah, for sure.
If they're taking up too much space.
Yeah, and like so that I think that was a challenging thing about Moonwink was there's so much stuff going on. It was sort of like, yeah, how in the world is all this stuff going to fit together? But we'll see. I think it worked out.
Nice. What about, well, actually, we'll come back to this in just a sec, because I think we'll take a break now and then come back in for the jam session. And I'm just going to keep asking you specific questions too. But when we come back, I want to really dig into what you learned about recording drums and how you get such great sounding drums on these records that you're making. So Rockstars, hang tight. We'll be back in just a moment for the jam session. And a reminder, we'll have links to all the stuff we're talking about, links to Nick's work, the Spinto Band, and many of these records he's worked on directly in the show notes, and you can just click through and check it out. So we'll see you in a sec for the jam session. Roswell Pro Audio brings you microphone design that is out of this world. Endorsed by a growing list of artists and producers like Phil Collen of Def Leppard, Ross Hogarth, who's recorded Van Halen, Ziggy Marley, and the Doobie Brothers, and Super Dupes, working with Drake, Mary J. Blige, and Eminem. These are all rock stars that have discovered just how great Roswell microphones sound. Check out the Mini K47, which uses a capsule modeled on the one in the vintage U47 at a street price of only $299. Or the beautiful Delphos condenser microphone with a capsule tuned like the vintage U67 with great clarity and far lower noise at a street price of only $899. In fact, you are hearing my voice right now on the beautiful Delphos microphone. These mics are carefully crafted by hand and immediately feel good even before you plug them in and hear how great they sound. These are well-built microphones that will last you and your studio a lifetime of great recording. Check out more audio examples of these awesome mics at roswellproaudio.com. Hey Rockstars, we're back now for the jam session. My guest today is Nick Krill, joining us from Philadelphia over Skype. And Nick, you ready to jam?
Oh, yes, indeed.
Sweet, man. All right, so we were just starting to talk about drums. I think one of the remarkable elements of these many records in your discography are great sounding drums. And I'm a big fan of great sounding drums. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about maybe what you learned when you were out working with Dave Trumpfio as far as recording drums. Maybe, did you carry any of that forward, or was it maybe just do you have a particular aesthetic for what makes great drums in a record?
Yeah, I think it sort of depends on the project. I think lately I've been really into like tight kind of sounding drums, and in the past few months, even just like more distortion on the drums, but trying to make it not be perceived like, oh man, these are blown out drums, but just figuring out ways to kind of like we were talking about the energy distortion, just like have something like using it to like percolate underneath to kind of like focus an area of the sound. But yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know. It's funny that you mentioned that because sometimes I honestly feel like I struggle with drums. So I'm glad
I think we all do,
you
right?
dig them. Yeah, they're really tricky. And I mean, like, honestly, I feel like sometimes there's even times where we're going, like one of my favorite drum sounds recently was kind of just by the seat of my pants because the musicians were cooking and like, oh shoot, I don't really have time to dial in this drums. Let's just slide into the skid and like make this rig work, Mm-hmm. So I think, I mean, that's a big part of it. And then, there's some specific, little drum techniques that everybody can try to get like good sounding drums. But then again, like, even if you're presented with a rotten scenario, just trying to figure out like, what's the bad part of the rotten and what's the good part of the rotten, and then just sort of like bring up the good and bring down the bad.
I like that. So I've talked about that as remove the suck. Like when you're in the studio, yeah. Sometimes you're approaching something and really the next move is to just identify what's bugging you and try and get it out of there.
Yeah, totally.
Whether it's production or sonic stuff.
Yeah, I think that's pretty cool. Another kind of cool, a friend of mine had this little outlook that I think is kind of useful to keep in the back of your mind similar to Remove the Suck was he always likes to be like going towards a positive rather than like trying to fix a negative. You know what I mean? Like always be going towards something that you want rather than away from something you don't. You know what I mean? Like, so frame it in your mind where you're going towards something nice rather than framing it in your mind like I'm trying to go away from this thing I don't like.
So subtractive EQ is cool as an engineer, but additive production is cool as a producer.
Yeah, maybe so. Although subtractive production, it's funny, like I think that's one of my most favorite things about mixing, and I'm lucky with like a lot of people I work with are very open to me, like kind of, well, it obviously depends on the person, but a lot of them are open to me kind of like monkeying with production in the mix phase, you know, by just like muting stuff or that kind of stuff. I really get a kick out of that. I think it kind of goes back to that whole idea of like, I like carving something out of a block of clay. It's sort of like you present me with whatever, 100 tracks. Maybe I can even carve something out of these tracks. And part of me wonders if it's has to do with like sometimes a lot of bands these days, maybe they're doing a lot of stuff in a studio or maybe they're doing some stuff by themselves at home. There's a tendency to kind of like keep adding.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of projects I've had in the last few years, there's been a lot of material that can be used to like then sculpt after, which is cool.
So you kind of dig,
you know,
you kind of dig that you have a lot to work with when it arrives. It's a lot to be able to take away from if you want.
Yeah, it's fun. I mean, it's all different processes, you know. It's like at the same time, it's maybe so like me as a mixer, I get a kick out of that because it's fun. But me as a producer, I try to avoid that because I know it takes a lot of time later, you know? Like having me as a mixer, like sit there for like a half hour being like, why is verse 2 not cool? It's like, oh, okay, wait a second. Let's like, there's a handful of overdubs in here that should only be happening at the final double chorus. They got no business being in verse 2. You know what I mean? Like that's me as a mixer, that's time that probably should have been spent with a producer getting the arrangement dialed. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting. But because I feel like I do wear a producer hat a lot of times, I kind of dig scratching around in the dirt like that. But I don't know.
I think the mute tool, the mute button is a great tool in mixing and arranging at that stage for sure. And sometimes all you need to do is just get rid of shit. But I always wonder about that. Like, why do we layer so much stuff on in the studio? I don't think we used to do it with tape machines, but we certainly do it in Pro Tools. And sometimes I suspect that like stuff just keeps getting buried. Like you already did something cool, but now it's turned down a little bit and you just don't notice it as much.
Totally. I think that's a huge problem. It's actually interesting. I heard it was some interview. It might have been on in a magazine or YouTube, but it was that guy, Joe Ciccarelli, saying that he just noticed like the idea of recording on a console where you're jumping between songs and every time you're kind of pulling the faders down and pushing them up again, you're sort of inherently like, oh, like maybe this one time you push the keyboards up first and you're like, oh, whoa, that's cool. Whoa, actually, you know what? The way the keyboards and the drums groove, that's really cool. And then you pull it down and do some other overdub and you're constantly like pushing stuff up and down.
Yeah.
And like
constantly discovering the song.
Yeah, exactly. But whereas with Pro Tools, you're sort of, or any audio workstation, you're opening it up and it's like, it's right where it was. And then you think like, something's not working. I guess I'll add something. Right. But you never take away. It's kind of this profound thing that he said is really cool. And it actually inspired me to approach my Pro Tools sessions like that. Whereas if I'm in the middle of a record, I'll just like pull the faders down in the Pro Tools session and kind of just like real quick rebuild a mix during a tracking session to try and tap into that process that he mentioned. Because I think it was really an interesting observation.
Yeah.
That I think we could all probably apply a little bit.
Well, it's kind of like, you know, if the mixing console or Pro Tools was a guitar, would you really not tune it every once in a while, you know?
Yeah.
It's like if it's a guitar, you tune it up before you do the song. You kind of get your instrument back in shape before you play it.
Yeah.
And it's that's really insightful, I think, of you and Joe. And actually, Joe will have just been on the podcast a few episodes before you, so you guys are sharing iTunes space.
Whoa, that's awesome.
Yeah, so I think that's very cool. Now, here's a question for you: are you using any kind of controllers with your Pro Tools? Do you feel like it's important to have those digital faders, or is everything a mouse? You're younger than I am. What do you have to say? How do you feel about mouses, looking at screens? How do your wrists feel now, having done this for 10 years, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah. Well, my wrist is still hanging in there. I got the old trackball working, which helps. But I actually do really like having a fader. I just have a simple, lowly old fader port with the one, the Personas one fader guy. Mm-hmm. And I think it is really valuable. And I think a lot of ways, just having something to close your eyes and balance is really, really cool. Like I remember I've only had it for maybe like a year and change. And I remember within the first week or month of using it, I was like, this vocal needs to be louder. All right, let me just like put this on I have these little Avantone mix cubes. It's like, let me throw it on the little speakers and I'll just like put it up. And I remember just like listening and riding the fader and then realizing like, whoa, I did a lot bigger boost than I thought of, which maybe before I would have said like, we'll just like put the little trim tool and like bump it up like a dB or like 0.7 or something, like, you know what I mean? For like a vocal up. But it was cool to like disassociate that from the screen. I think there's definitely some value to that. When it comes to balancing.
Rides are different with a fader too. You're kind of like,
yeah, for sure,
feeling it out with your, moving around. It's quite different than being uber precise with clip gain or, looking at the actual screen.
Yeah. I mean, they're both clip gains great too, but I think the other cool thing about the fader is it gives you an opportunity to have a unique sense of like your brain boom into the music, like how you physically move an object versus like if you just go and like click the volume line. I mean, you can do it with the trackball too, but there is something a lot different. Like you can be like aggressive with a fader in a way that you can't really be aggressive with a mouse or a trackball. Like just like really yank the fader and like do a crazy delay throw or like throw something to a weird feedback or even like if a guitar is chugging along, like, ride the fader to the groove, like to make like whatever, like maybe someone's just chugging evenly on an acoustic. Maybe you're just like grooving to the tune, pushing the fader up and down to kind of give it a little bounce in a way that would be like completely unique to the way you're hearing the music. I think that's kind of cool, in the days of the DAW, little ways to get the human element in there.
DAW days.
The DAW days of recording, yeah,
the DAW days of recording. So, it also reminds me that that's kind of the difference between programmed drums versus, played drums. If you play them in on pads or something, it's that one's a human performance and one's just, drawing it out on the screen. And those are different ways to compose as well.
Yeah, definitely. And none is better or worse than the other. Just think about the reason why you're doing it and make sure it's cool. Like the classic thing of like that I think it's whatever Fleetwood Mac song it is, that they specifically looped the drums because they wanted it to be like hypnotic,
Oh yeah. What was
so it's
that?
Like,
I just heard about that this weekend, actually.
Maybe I want to say Dream?
Yeah, might have been. And they had to loop the tape. It was like, 13 feet of tape or something that they had to loop around the room.
Yeah.
And they got it just right.
Yeah, doing it for a reason,
So you mentioned getting drums right. You said, there are a few different ways that usual things you can do. Do you mind sharing some of the things that you have in mind when you think of that? What are some typical things you do to tighten up the drums, make them sound punchy, make them sit well in a mix, rock, do whatever you need?
Yeah, let's see. I mean, mix-wise, I like to do, I have like a couple different sort of like parallel buses that I use a lot for drums. So like I'll have a couple aux sends going to just like different compressors or different little distortion things to kind of like pepper drums, individual tracks into. Mm-hmm. And then like another one that I have a final like all drums bus, and then a separate parallel to that too. So that's like a lot of parallel compression. I think is really cool.
And that has the effect of just kind of gluing the drums together to sort of make it seem more consistent in the end.
Yeah, just kind of like gluing it or giving it like energy or something like that. Like I feel like, you know, like slower attacks, faster release are always kind of cool for drums. Mm-hmm. You can get into trouble with that sometimes if like a snare drum with a hi-hat bleed, you might want to be careful with the fast release there. Otherwise, you'll just have like the hi-hat coming in like crazy. Right. But so yeah, for mixing a lot of sort of like parallel stuff and trying to like, if a multiple mic setup, mess around with high-low pass filters to just kind of like hatchet stuff off that might be getting in the way. That sometimes can be really helpful.
Do you find yourself dealing with drums and drum tracks sometimes where you really want a consistent kick and snare? It's like boom, psh, psh, just that snare that's like got a splat and it sits just right in the mix, but it's not really there in the performance. And do you have ways of kind of addressing that?
Well, yeah, actually there's one kind of cool newfangled way. Well, I mean, I guess one way would be a sample could get you there, triggering a consistent sample to blend in. Mm-hmm. But there's this other cool, there's this company Sound Radix that makes a thing called the Drum Leveler. That's a plugin that kind of is it's sort of like it's almost like a gate / transient shaper / magic voodoo thing, compression expander kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But it's really cool. You can actually set a threshold, and it can actually like even out a rotten, or not rotten, but like maybe a less even performance in a really cool way that actually kind of does exactly what you're sort of describing. And it's kind of neat to not have to rely on samples, because then you can maybe salvage some from the actual performance.
Yeah. So this is a plugin you might put on the kick track and you might put it on the snare track, and it would sort of give them both sort of like a consistent, even quality.
Yeah, totally. It's great for kick and snare and toms and stuff like that. It's even cool for like, one of the crazy voodoo things about it is like the threshold. You can set a threshold, not even like you would a gate or a expander where it's the typical kind of like, if something goes over this point, it acts. You can actually like set the threshold to a region, like a dynamic range of the sound. Mm-hmm. So for example, I've used it on drum machine tracks. Like sometimes I like to use a drum machine as a click track just to kind of have like some kind of neat mojo for the click. Mm-hmm. And then a lot of times those drum machines end up being like, oh man, what if we just percolate that underneath the groove? And what's neat is like with this drum lever thing, you could even dial it into like the hi-hat portion of a drum machine and just even isolate that. It's kind of crazy what it can do. But it's fun, yeah.
When you use a drum machine in production, do you like to use outboard drum machines and you plug it, in an analog input into Pro Tools, or do you like using plug-in drum machines at all?
Most of the time, it's an analog external thing. Yeah, most of the time it's not a plug-in drum machine. It's like an old, just like a drum box or something, or like a Maestro. Mm-hmm. Maestro drum machine, or like an old organ drum machine, something like that, that can kind of, it's loose or crazy.
Yeah.
And it's just, sometimes it's more fun to play to like listen to like a groove, especially like if you can set the drum machine or like to give you like a feeling, Mm-hmm. Like I love using old like Optagon loops for drum machines just because they're just so groovy sounding.
Do you have an Optagon?
I do have an Optigon, but for actually using Optigon drum machines, I actually do use just digital loops of them because the Optigons are notoriously temperamental and just a little bit easier to sometimes just have a little like 16 or 8 bar whatever loop, and then you can like elastic audio it to get your tempo or something.
Nice. Did you say they are temperamental?
Hey-o.
Oh, hey, all right. So let's dig into some more records you did. Nightlands, great band. I think the song maybe I listened to or the record was Lost Moon, and I know you had something to do with the band and the album. One of the things that I noticed, and I heard it in others of your production, is that you have a great understanding of space and using reverb and ambience in production to create kind of otherworldly sounds. And also, there were some really great acoustic guitars that just kind of reminded me of being sort of thinned out in a cool way, almost like a David Bowie record. And I wondered if you wanted to talk about creating great ambient sounds with guitars and also cool ways to capture acoustics, so it doesn't just sound like I'm doing a Nashville singer-songwriter demo,
Yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, I guess first things first, shout out to Dave Hartley, who is the mastermind of Nightlands. He's an amazing musician, and I think a lot of that just comes from his brain. And also shout out that particular song you mentioned, the guy John Lowe mixed it, who's a super cool dude, Philly-based guy that is now doing work all over the place. Nice. So those two brains together get you some amazing sounding stuff. But yeah, that acoustic, Dave also has this amazing acoustic guitar that's just an old like 90s Guild, I think, that is the craziest, most beautiful sounding guitar. And when it's plugged in through its crappy like Fishman in the hole pickup, it really is like, it's strange. Like when he's like, oh yeah, we'll just let's try this DI. It's like, oh, okay. I was like, wow, that is just flat out gorgeous.
A DI that actually sounds good.
Yeah, it's crazy. It really is amazing. This like mojo of this guitar and this crazy junky pickup. But yeah, so that acoustic on that one would have been that. But beyond that, one thing that I've been actually doing a bunch lately is peppering in to an acoustic track. This isn't necessarily to do with that record, but just acoustics in general. Been paying attention to like the chord inversions when you're playing an acoustic, and maybe doubling it with a different inversion to kind of like thicken stuff out, but still have their own like discrete space in the sound, where it's not just like a mush. Like a mushy double. Instead
of doubling it with the same open E chord, one of them is the open E, but the other one is like a different voicing of the E chord.
Yeah, definitely. Like paying attention to voicings. And then even on top of that, getting my little Jeff Lynne on and doing I found like a cool, it seems like gets you instant Jeff Lynne is I mic up a Nashville strung electric, just played acoustically. And it just gives you this crazy prickle that like, it's like this prickle shimmer thing.
Wait,
does so really cool stuff.
It's an electric that's got high strings on it, but you're micing it up like an acoustic and strumming that?
Yeah, exactly.
That's my
cool,
first, man.
Yeah, my first guitar, my little PV Predator. It's got a high strung set on there, and I don't even plug it into an amp. I just mic it, and it just gives like articulation.
That's cool. I love that thinking outside the box stuff. And I have to confess that I feel like I'm constantly kicking myself for not doing as much of that these days as I used to. And I feel like I've seen sessions, change too sometimes, where it's like, if you're doing sessions and you're sort of doing it as your work and you feel like you're more conscious of the time frame of the day and stuff, it's so easy to let the experimentation be the first casualties in a session.
Yeah, it's tough, man. I feel like especially these days, budgets are tighter and it really, I think you're right. It's tough to be able to like, sometimes you're just like, oh man, gotta stay on task. Can't monkey around with this stuff. I mean, that's a great thing about being a recording artist myself, is I can just be my own guinea pig on my own time.
Yeah.
Where I kind of like, all right, well, if I fall flat on my face now, that's okay.
Yeah, good point. And then also, just learning what these sounds are ahead of time so that you have sort of a wider palette that you can pull from your brain on a session to test things out, instead of feeling like the experiment really has to happen on the client's time.
Yeah. Try and be efficient with your wackiness.
Oh, I know what else I was going to think of was, the time spent recording. It's like, if you do a little of experimenting and come up with a really cool idea, maybe you'll discover that you don't need so many overdubs, which you're going to spend a whole bunch of time getting anyway, to just delete when it comes time to mix.
Yeah, totally. I feel like that is true. Is like if you can make a sound like as much of a hook like as like an arrangement thing, you can, it might take up a lot of like real estate, but if it's like a hook in and of itself, then that might be like your arrangement might be well on its way to being awesome.
Let's talk a little bit about ambient guitars, real spaced out kind of stuff. What are some approaches for that? I mean, is it like pick a guitar, pick an amp, and it's all about the pedals? Is it take a guitar and treat what's coming back through the microphone? Is it like, is there a lot of this stuff that needs to be discovered at the mix stage? What do you want to say about that whole process of like creating really unique spaces with all this reverb and delays?
I like to try and go for as much of that in the tracking as possible, like just to kind of sort of like jumping off what we were just talking about, something that will inform the performance and inform the part, So like if there's some kind of modulation or delay or something, like put a stomp box on there or do a distant room mic or crank the amp spring up, or even just like do a separate mic that is running to like something like an H3000 or something and just printing that into, just so it's like you're not leaving to your imagination like, oh, I'll find a cool reverb for this later.
We'll fix it in the mix. We'll make it'll be cool. It'll be so cool later when we're done.
Yeah. But I mean, plenty of that stuff still gets like dialed and fine tuned in mix stage. But even just like, just trying to like slow and steady pushing towards where you want to go sonically, like at each stage of the game, like can get you just trudging towards where you want to go.
Now, as a producer, do you have a crazy collection of pedals now, and are you constantly expanding that? Or do you find that just each band and artist you work with, they're already bringing in this, palette of sounds that they're capturing with their guitars?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of going back to that whole idea of like treating stuff mechanically, is like part of that was I just couldn't really get a lot of pedals to work for me. So like that's almost what pushed me in that way. So I have like a nice little crew of cool like tremolo and delay pedals and a couple cool overdrives. But I do like to kind of lean on whatever, if a band is pedal heavy, definitely lean on what they're doing, because I feel like they have a relationship with their devices, and let's see what that is first, and then we can kind of monkey with it from there. Yeah, I think it's very cool. It's like, the same pedal will be used a million different ways by different guitarists or different keyboard players or whatever, different drummers. So just see where they're going to take it, and then use that as a cue to kind of as a starting point.
How about when you're mixing? Have you found some plugins that you're like, man, these guys always, I'm able to like pull out really cool reverbs and delays?
It's interesting. I've been like super into just like the deverb lately, actually.
Nice.
The little church setting that has that strange, it's got a strange like pitch shift in it. Whatever the church setting is in deverb, and I have a feeling like in 5 years, I'm just going to listen to everything I do and be like, oh, geez, dude, why could have you please use something other than the church setting? But whatever. I'm riding high on it now.
Nice, man. Hey, we used Deverb a lot for the Spinto Band. Oh, you remember what else we did? Remember we fed the mixes out to Club Roar from Alex the Great, and then we used that as a giant echo chamber, and we kind of blended that in a little bit on almost everything.
Yeah, that was cool. That was cool. And another nice little reverb, McDSP makes this nice little impulse response reverb called Revolver, and then you can even import your own little impulses and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that thing's, I don't hear too many people talking about that, but it's really useful.
Nice. All right, so another band you worked with, Clap Your Hands, Say Yeah. You're still working with them.
Yeah.
A lot of great swirly guitars and keyboards on that one. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the sounds and how you like to get them with those guys? Also, there was one that you linked to. It was Fireproof, which I guess isn't necessarily so swirly. But that's definitely a song with a ton of space in it. Great sounds, great drums, the whole deal. And I love the dry finger snap that happens halfway through. I think that was really smart.
Yeah, that was awesome. Alec is the main singer-songwriter in that band, and that was his snapping, and it's super cool. It is just like, it's like a weird vacuum, you know?
Yeah, it's a bold move, because so often you take any percussive sound like that, and we immediately start looking for some plug-in to create space all around it, you know? And this was like the opposite. This was like, it's going to be super dry and just sitting out in front of everything and sound kind of 3D.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's fun. Like that song was a pretty cool exercise in like the gaps of the song, you know? Like if you listen to the bass groove and the drums, it was very much like that whole, like the negative space was definitely a part of that. And even the way his vocal bounces, you know, like it was all sort of having all those things kind of just like, you know, you need the gaps in order to like define a rhythm that the vocal can bounce on and stuff like that. And then once that sort of like almost like spoken wordy kind of vocal line, I don't know, it's not spoken word, but it's very like rhythmic, you know? So that's sort of just like kind of informed that whole path for that tune.
It was sort of doubled with delay or something like that.
There's a couple moments of like delay and actually, you know what's really cool? Part of that is actually just scratch vocal bled into a room mic, you know, like a just as like a happy accident.
Yeah, that's always a cool thing. I mean, it's funny, you know, sometimes as engineers, we're so quick to beat ourselves up for something bleeding in that was meant to be a scratch, like a vocal. Not realizing that actually it's the greatest thing ever because it creates a ghostly double for the lead that you might add later.
Yeah, totally. I always think about that with like White Album Beatles stuff. You hear some weird Phantom stuff. And then kudos to Alec for like having a mindset to just go with it, you know? Like that record is not super precise in that way, you know? There is like a looseness to it and like a band kind of like being a little raucous. It was really fun to work on that.
So another band, Roar, Impossible Animals, there was a song called Dream, and I made a note that it had these crazy, trippy, droney kind of keyboards that kind of give way to a mellotron and stuff. And I don't know if you can specifically remember any of that stuff, but I wondered if you wanted to talk about, you know, recording keyboards and to create drones and space within a song. And, you know, again, not making them sound like you just pulled up Logic and just played the, you know, the patch that came with the app, but that you're actually creating a sound.
Yeah, for sure. So that, I think keyboards in general, I really like to just like have a little pedal or some kind of gizmo to monkey with while I'm tracking the keyboard. Like you said, just to kind of like as a little step away from a preset kind of deal. So it doesn't have to, I'm not the biggest pedal guy. I'm mostly just like delays, tremolos, kind of like classic like reverb amp effects.
Yeah.
So just kind of like step it in that direction. And then as far as like creating drones, just like thinking about the on that specific Roar song, Owen, the main dude in that band, is like an expert arranger. So a lot of that is down to his amazing ear for arrangement.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that itself is the key, like to just bring forward to other projects, is just like thinking about the arrangement and like where is the keyboard gonna sit musically with all the other instruments, trying to like, you know, make sure it's not clouding over anything, so it can have its little like area. If you map that out with the notes that you're gonna play, and they're not gonna conflict with like another main instrument,
Mm-hmm.
you'd be in real good shape.
Well, it sounded like they were kind of the sound was sort of evolving through the song too. You know, do you like to record keyboards where instead of just one sound and you're just simply changing the notes of the chords, where you're actually kind of changing, slowly sweeping the filter or kind of like morphing the sound a little bit while you're recording it?
Yeah, it depends on the part, but I do like that. Like my normal keyboard rig has a memory man always engaged on it.
Mm-hmm.
So like just sitting on top of the keyboard, I can have the memory man there and just sort of like breathe on one of the knobs weird, and it kind of just does a warble. I kind of, for that scenario, I almost like the memory man to like tweak the delay so it almost sounds like an old cassette tape warping, you know? That's another fun thing to do with keyboard pads actually, is just bust them out, record them onto one of those little dictaphone cassette tapes.
Yeah.
And then re-import it. You can actually, especially for like paddy droney stuff, you can just, it hardly matters if you sync it up at all, but if you need to, you can slate it and then use Elastic Audio to like combat any drift of the cassette motor. But those things are super cool, like a little dictaphone and like even shaking it or like putting your finger on the spool to like get it to warble, all that kind of stuff.
That's
and
great.
Like blending that in can get real soupy and cool.
I feel like I've sort of let my dictaphones go in the studio. You know, I've had some pretty cool things, but they don't get turned on as much. We used to use the Crapsta mic. Remember that? The little mini cassette recorder.
Cassette.
And that was such a great device. But then you'd like, if you lost track of the little cable that would take the headphone out and run it into your DI, then, you know, you're kind of out of luck for a minute. It's kind of like losing your lightning cable for your iPhone or something.
Yeah, I think maybe that's the good lesson for the whole idea of like taking a little chance here and there in the studio. If you can have some ideas, like a little palette of wackiness, or I don't even want to say wackiness, but just like a palette of ideas you want to try.
Palette of cool.
Palette of interesting that you want to explore. Have it set up so that you can try it real quick. And then if it doesn't work, go, all right, that's enough of that. Have it like ready to go and then ready to turn off immediately. So it's like that's a good way to like not monkey with your session too much. I mean, that was kind of going back to the idea of using like a console firing on all cylinders, which was kind of sweet to just have aux sends to be like, oh, okay, like bang the aux send up, like, oh, is it cool? Like, oh yeah, it is. Oh, nice. All right, we're good. Uh-oh, not cool. Turn the aux send down. We're back to where we were, you know?
Yeah.
It's not a million like, oh, let me get the right cable and like, let me get this adapter.
Yeah.
Just have some ideas.
Why don't you guys
like,
take a lunch
ready
break
to
and
go.
I'll set up this one thing.
Yeah, right.
It's too often like that, right?
Yeah, it can be a wormhole.
All right, so another band, National Eye Ramparts. I was making a note that it kind of reminded me a little bit of the Strokes, just in terms of, I think it was like the kind of distorted vocal sound a little bit, that kind of attitude, single note, eighth note parts. And my question to you was, how do you, when you're doing a song like that, if you can recall that one, and it might have potentially a real buildup of mid-range sounds, what are some advice you have for how to make that all work together so you still have this great track like that, and avoid too much kind of mid-range buildup between all the instruments that are all kind of having an attitude?
Yeah, let's see. That's a good question. That one's a long time ago, actually, trying to think back. And honestly, I feel like when I was working on that, I probably didn't have the right answer for you. I was probably just, winging it and probably did have too much mid-range build up.
Do you kind of run into that stuff these days, though? Do you feel like you pick up on those cues a lot sooner when you're producing a record in the recordings?
Yeah, definitely. It's just, I think, it's just a matter of just kind of just dialing your ear into that mid-range area. It's really precious real estate. So you kind of got to figure out, what part of it is going to accentuate the instrument you're interested in and what part is going to be annoying. There's a lot of cool, I feel like the trendy thing these days that is actually definitely helpful is these dynamic EQs that are all around.
Yeah, tell us about those. I haven't actually even used one yet.
Oh man, they're a lot of fun. I've used a bunch actually because they're all there's one called Soothe, which is really interesting. That's almost like you can dial in these crazy notches, so it automatically notches out stuff that's above a threshold. I guess that one's really cool. That's really good for getting rid of really annoying resonances. Then there's the McDSP dynamic EQ that's just super. That one's cool because it's all that McDSP stuff is really easy on the CPU and really straightforward. Isotope has some really great stuff. Their new Ozone even has a spectral shaper thing that seems kind of soothe-ish, where you're you can focus in on specific frequency ranges and sort of let their EQ bands kind of ride the parts that are kind of funky. Actually, one thing that's here maybe going back to your original question might be one kind of cool mid-range idea would be a specific technique was taking one of those dynamic EQs to kind of ride out some frequency areas that's rotten or is bugging you, and then afterwards or in parallel use some kind of distortion to generate harmonics in that area. So it's kind of you're taking away that area that's grating to you, but you're systematically adding cool sounding things to that area.
Oh, that's interesting. I like that idea.
Yeah, so it's so maybe for distortion and stuff, you're generating harmonics based on the tone, So you're kind of getting these sounds in those frequency ranges that are all sort of relative to the fundamental or whatever the main guts of that sound is. So it's kind of cool, a way to cut away distracting things and re-add things that make sense with the music.
I dig that, man. I like that idea. I think that's going to get a lot of wheels turning on the with our listeners. So a couple of other great folks that you worked with. You spent time at Inner Ear Studios in DC with Don Zientara. Do you want to tell some stories about that?
Yeah, that was great. Well, I went to school down there, so that was it's kind of funny how I fell into that area. I was down in school there, going to a recording school, and just being into indie rock and stuff like that. Inner Ear was kind of the cool indie rock studio, punk studio. It's kind of legendary. Don Zientara worked with Fugazi and Minor Threat and stuff like that. It's kind of this legend in that Discord record scene. And it's I remember being at home one kind of Christmas break or spring break, and my parents sitting me down well kid, what's your plan here? What's your 5-year plan, this recording thing? I don't really understand it, And my parents are really cool, very into the arts, but their kid has these pie in the sky dreams of rock and roll and recording. And I say my big goal for next year is to try and get in with this place Inner Ear and this guy Don Zientara. He's really making the music that I'm interested in. And my dad said, "Wait, what was his name?" And I said, "Oh, Don Zientara." And he's like, "I know that guy." It's what? My dad, who is, works in a museum, knows nothing about punk rock. Lo and behold, worked with Don Zatara back in the 70s at the National Gallery of Art. Yeah. So it was kind of crazy. And I I got out an issue of Tape Op and was like, this guy right here. And he's like, oh yeah, that's Don.
That's old Don.
I think I have his address here. I'll like send him a postcard and see if he's around, And so I actually got introduced to one of like legendary punk rock engineer through my my dad, believe it or not. And Don was really nice and he was really kind and like let me come in the studio and help me out on a few sessions, kind of like let me like, okay, find a band that you're friends with and bring them in, and I'll kind of like let you run the show, but I'll just be here to kind of like help you get the lay of the land. And then, it was nice enough to kind of like let me bring little projects in there as they came along and stuff like that. And
was that an
amazing
internship for you, or was that actually one of your first paid engineering gigs?
No, it wasn't an internship. Like that's kind of what I wanted. I was like, oh, could I be an intern, your understudy, an intern? I'd love to learn from you. And he was like, nah, I don't really do that. But what I can do is just like, I'll give you a handful of sessions where I'll be around, Nice. And then from there on is just like, maybe I'll cut you a deal on the rate to the room so your bands can afford it, and then you can just start coming in. So it's kind of cool. I just like, was able to do some recording there when I was in college, and yeah, it was cool. Super nice dude.
Right on, man. Well, now here's somebody else that you worked with, I think maybe kind of recently, was Dave Friedman, who's done all kinds of great records. And I wondered what you wanted to share stories about that. What did you learn from Dave?
Yeah, Dave, he mixed the Clap Your Hands record that I produced last year. And that was really fun. I feel like kind of really lucky in a way, because he was honestly one of the guys when I was in middle school looking at records on credits. Like I saw his name, like, oh, that sounds cool. This record sounds awesome. And this is the guy in charge of it. Wow, there's a guy in charge of the way record sounds. Oh my gosh, that's the thing. So it's really kind of amazing to kind of, I feel like I probably was a total like weirdo nerd pest in some respects up there. Just kind of like, because I had like 15-year-old me coming back in my head being like a fanboy or something.
Yeah.
But honestly, like the biggest takeaway kind of was the same thing as with Chad Blake, was just not to be a wimp and like be a bold artist. That was a crazy thing. It was really amazing to kind of hear these songs that you work on, very intimately in the production phase, and then you kind of know where they stand, right? Like you've done rough mixes and you've kind of messed with the balance and experimented with a lot of them, and then to hear someone like him take it to this amazing new space, and just having had that like intimate knowledge of the components and where it was so enlightening. It was just crazy. You know what I mean? It just made me just realize I need to just really push myself further.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
So it's like, you recognize that you had almost a little bit of a preciousness about what the record was and what the parts were that made up the song and the record, and well, it goes like this, and then you watch him do something kind of different with it and realize there was like a whole new threshold you weren't aware of yet, or like a whole new headroom for creativity that you didn't even know was available.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. Like a whole different, like, all of a sudden you got a bunch more bits to mess with of creativity that you didn't realize you could play with. But yeah, and I think part of it too was just like, I don't know, maybe this happens to everybody in this process of recording, but you're maybe at a point where you're trying to hone your, like the craft side, like going back to what you're saying about like, oh, make sure the mid-range is balanced. Like, how do you do that? Like, that's definitely part of a craft of recording. But then there's this whole other part of the art of recording that just blows that out of the water. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I feel like working on that record, it was like, I was and like knowing that he was going to hear it, I was like, oh, I want to make sure I'm like doing everything nice and cool, and it's sounding nice and cool and good. And then he would just, and then I like hearing what he can do with it. It's like, man, you really got to quit being a wimp and just like go for it, Nick.
That's cool, man. Do you remember any specific ways of doing stuff that you learned from that? You know, did you learn some cool new way to do an EQ or, you know, manage a reverb or something like that? Or did you guys run stuff out of the box through funky cool stuff at that stage?
Well, he mixes all out of the box entirely. So he's just like mixing on his Neve board. But like, honestly, it's beyond specific things. It's more just like, it's just more general than that. It's not like, oh, a specific way to EQ. It's more just like, just need to push yourself to get stuff exciting. I don't know, you know, it's like, there was times where I was like, oh man, what is this? Why do these guitars sound so cool? It's like, oh, I'm running it through this weird DBX thing, like little hi-fi thing. But it kind of doesn't matter that that's what he did. It's more just like, why did you think the guitars were bad, like not cool sounding before, you know? And it was just like, I just want to get stuff exciting.
Did you get a sense that he automatically wanted to mess with everything, or that maybe there was a mental process that identified that there was room for something, there was room or a place for a sound to go to, and therefore I'm going to try and get it there?
I don't know. I don't think I'm qualified to speak on his way his brain works.
Yeah, fair enough.
You know, it's like, that would be a question for him.
That's a good point. I'm going to have Dave on the show.
Yeah, get him on here. I think maybe one takeaway that I can just speak to, as like I said, I heard where stuff was and then where it went to. One kind of cool thing interesting takeaway for myself was, I feel like, you know, Dave has this sort of like one of the things he's known for is like, oh, this bombastic sounding thing, like it's all crunchy and cool. And so I sort of was like listening for these things, and one thing I kind of noticed was like, there's a lot of times that it sounded like there was distortion or bombastic processes going, but they weren't necessarily like, you wouldn't think like, oh wow, that is a crazy distorted sound, but it was like distortion used to kind of focus an area of the sound, you know? Mm-hmm. Like, oh, I want to, like the kick drum doesn't sound distorted, like in quotes, distorted. But when you really listen to it, you realize like, oh, the reason that the kind of knock of the kick drum sounds the way it does is because there's like distortion blended in for that like mid-range area. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it made me realize like the whole idea of like, do parallel distortion, do hyper compression. It's not about like some crazy sounding thing. It's about, it can be used like subtly underneath things to kind of just like give them a feeling rather than like make it sound bombastic.
Yeah. It's like harmonic enhancement.
Yeah.
Bringing out more of what's already in there, just helping highlight it.
Yeah, that's totally. Cool. Or just steering the tone where you want it to go.
Well, so Nick, we've gone a good long stretch here, and I think we're coming up near the end here. So rather than kind of go through all the usual jam session questions, maybe we can just kind of skip forward through them and hit a couple on the way out. Do you have any? I will ask you a couple of these. Okay. Any suggestions for people about the business side of this? You know, your inspirational quote at the beginning was essentially "Can't stop, don't stop," which is like a good strategy or a good like battle cry for continuing on in this for a whole lifetime and career. What other advice do you want to share around the business side of doing this as a career and more than just a hobby for people?
I feel like maybe just something to think about, not even like a business savvy thing. Let me think about this. Okay. I would say pay really foster your relationships with your contemporaries in whatever music or recording scene you're in. I think that's kind of like a really important thing to keep in mind when you're like building your career, because it's sort of like if you foster those relationships with the other young engineers or producers or bands, hopefully the rising tide, you'll all kind of like bring yourself up together, you know? Mm-hmm. Like the idea of having a great mentor, that's great too, or like learning from your elders. But it's also professionally, I feel like I've seen more career advancements, like more gigs, more business opportunities have come about from like my relationships with my contemporaries, and like the social relationships I have within the music scene that I'm like hanging out in.
Yeah.
So I feel like that would be my go-to sort of business outlook for anybody.
And you're entering a whole new chapter too, because you're now a dad.
Yeah, that's true.
So I
don't know how that has to do with it.
Well, I mean, it's like, it just, I think that our perspective on what it means to have a career in music shifts. We have different perspectives when it's just us, you know, working all hours of the day versus us as a family, a dad, you know, and trying to balance that against work and stuff too.
I gotcha. Yeah, for sure. It certainly refocuses your life, and it has been for the better for me, luckily.
Yeah.
And it actually has been an amazing help with me on the business side, because like you said, when you're just solo, you can just say yes to everything and just pound away and go crazy in the studio. But then you realize like, okay, let me focus on the things that are actually really positive.
Right.
You know?
Right. Okay. So, here we'll wrap up, but, let me hit you with this question. This is a hypothetical question. Love to ask it on the show and end with this. We're going to take the Wayback Studio machine and you're going to go back and find young Nick in the mid 90s, maybe late 90s. And you're going to have an opportunity to give yourself one bit of advice. What would you tell yourself if you could go and say, here's the single most important thing you need to know, Nick, to be a rock star of the studio yourself one day? Mm-hmm. What would you go back and tell yourself?
I would say make sure that everyone you're hanging out with is way more talented than you. Get inspired by them and soak up their knowledge. And then beyond that, I would say maybe even make sure everyone you're hanging out with is even way more motivated than you, and just to keep like that fire lit under you.
I think that's good advice. Great advice.
Yeah.
I hear people talking a lot about the power of surrounding yourself. You know, this idea that we're the average of the 5 people we surround ourselves with, or something to that effect. So,
okay. Yeah, totally.
You know, I think that surrounding yourself with people that push you to take what you're doing to the next level is great advice.
Yeah. Got to keep those people around.
Groovy. Well, Nick, let the rock stars know how they can find you and learn more about you and your music. If they need to contact you to make their next hit record, let us know how they do that.
Sure. Well, let's see. I have my Gmail is just paperlabrecording@gmail.com. You can just drop me a line. And I think I have a Instagrams and stuff for the band I'm in, Teen Men, which is just I think I'm a bad social media guy. It's just Teen Men at Instagram, you know, Instagram Teen Men. And nice. I think the Twitter has an underscore in there. So I'm around.
Nice. Do you have a website for the studio too?
Yeah, I just have a Tumblr page, which is just like my name at Tumblr.
Okay, cool.
I'll be in there. But yeah.
All right, dig in. Rockstars. We'll put links to all the stuff Nick's mentioning in the show notes, which you can find at rsrockstars.com, or just click through if you're listening to the podcast on your mobile device or whatever. It's just right there. Just click through on the player and you'll find it. Nick, thank you so much for being on Recording Studio Rockstars with us Dude, it's always a pleasure to hang out with you. Great to reconnect with you, and really fun discovering all this music you've been creating.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me on. It's a great show. Appreciate it.
All right, man. Groovy. We'll see you around the studio soon.
See you, man.
All right, cheers. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help reach more people. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And if you want more free content, all you have to do is text RS Rockstars to 33444. Again, that's RS Rockstars to 33444, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, and podcast updates. And I'll let you know about any upcoming giveaway offers, all totally free. Thanks for listening. I'm Lij Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.